My guest today is musicologist and music theorist, Professor Adem Merter Birson. He is an Adjunct Assistant Professor of Music at Hofstra University. His primary research deals with the relationship between chromaticism and form in the string quartets of Joseph Haydn. We will talk about Haydn, Partimento, Sonata form, and even get a little bit into classical Turkish music. Professor Birson, welcome to the Nikhil Hogan Show.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Nikhil. I've been following you and your show for quite a long time, and I'm honored to be a guest.
It's great to have you. And so we got a little bit about your background in the article we did a week and a half ago, but I'd love to get a little bit more about your early training in music and the paths that led you to where you are today.
Sure. Well, I was always a musician. In fact, I began taking piano lessons at an early age. But my first love was actually heavy metal music.
I saw that on your YouTube channel.
I started playing bass in heavy metal and then even death metal bands. One group that we were in was called Hulk Blood, and we even made a CD together. But you know, that was not meant to be, as my my sort of musical interests took me into university, and so I became a music major at Queens College in the CUNY system, City University of New York. And so, you know, doing both of those things, the band and university at the same time, was a lot of fun. But then the band sort of broke up, didn't work out, and so I just focused more on my training in musicology and music theory at Queens College.
Right. And you mentioned that it was a lecture on Haydn that got you hooked on Haydn. Could you tell me about that?
Oh, yeah. It was actually, so this was a music history class, part of the music history sequence. In those days, we had like way more Western music history and Western music theory as part of like a sequence. And so I was in the sort of the Baroque classical class with this professor who was one of my idols in my undergraduate days, Henry Burnett. And he was a music historian, but he had his own theory of music, which was based on completion of chromatic scales, or like harmonically supported chromatic scales in instrumental music. And so he was the one who would do analyses of pieces in this music history class. And I thought that was fantastic, because it really gave you insight into pieces of music in a history class in ways that I hadn't been introduced to before. But the thing with, I fell in love with so many composers that way. For that class, Handel, Bach. But Haydn, for some reason, spoke to me. And I think one of the reasons for it is I'd never heard music or a composer that so spoke through music, and that to me really grabbed my attention. It was Opus 20 number 5, Haydn's string quartet in F minor. And the way that Professor Burnett was talking about it, there was this chromatic stuff going on. Of course, nowadays I don't really follow that theory anymore. But the way that the logic of the music and the form of it, the construction of it, the way that the melodies fit with the harmony, and just the way that the ensemble interacted with each other, I was just blown away by it. And it was just this interaction between the musicians and the form and the harmony, and so by the end of it, Professor Burnett said that Haydn always signed Laus Deo, thanks to God or praise God, at the end of every piece. He was a devout Catholic. But he said he probably was saying, thank you, God, that I can do this with music. That was the end of the lecture. And I thought, wow, that was just amazing. So I was a Haydn fan ever since. And in every Haydn piece I've ever played or studied, I've never been disappointed. I've had that same feeling.
That's amazing. By the way, that Opus 20, those are string quartets. Are those are not the Sun string quartets, right? Are they?
Yes, those are.
Those are okay, and those are the famous ones. Could you talk about those in particular? Were those the ones that kind of earned him the nickname, like the father of the string quartet?
Well, yeah. So those, it's this long debate in Haydn scholarship which string quartets are the most important. Of course, nicknames are applied after the fact. So Haydn wouldn't have called those the Sun Quartets, but they're interesting for the fact that they end. Many of them end with fugues as the fourth movement, which is important. There's significant when you talk about the string quartet genre because there's four players,
Right.
and so each player gets a voice in the fugue. But the ones that preceded Opus 9 and Opus 17, in my opinion, I wrote my dissertation on those, are equally as proficient. I find them to be full of dramatic musical detail. What's interesting is those three sets, Opus 9, Opus 17, and Opus 20, are all composed within a 4-year span between 1769 and 1772. And so those are the first time that Haydn returns to the genre after about 15 years. He had initially been commissioned, almost like there's this story in Griesinger's biography of Haydn, where so this guy Griesinger actually goes to talks with Haydn in the final days of his life and gets these anecdotes from him about his musical life and all the stories, the legends that supposedly happened. And one of the things that one of the stories that Haydn tells is that he composed his first string quartet by accident. He was engaged to perform or compose music for Baron Fürnberg in Vienna. And there happened to be 4 musicians, Haydn himself, Albrechtsberger, Baron Fürnberg, and then I think it was a priest or one other person that was sort of in this social circle. And they asked Haydn to compose something that could be performed by 2 violins, a viola, and a cello, which happened to be the instruments that they all played. And so he wrote his first 2 sets of quartets, Opus 1 and Opus 2, around 1755 or mid 1750s, according to the anecdote and according to what sort of the documents bear out. So those quartets were actually really good. And so it's right off the bat that Haydn becomes a prolific quartet composer. And so then there's these 15 years or so of time that pass. And what happens in those years is Haydn becomes more well-known. Part of it is he becomes engaged at the court of Esterházy with the prince, the Esterházy family. And so he becomes the Kapellmeister, and he's engaged with all these now.
Professor Birson, how does he land that very, very good gig? How does he get that? What did he do to earn that?
It's a lot of things. So one of the things that I'm sure we'll talk about is he does apprentice with Nicola Porpora, also around that same time in the 1750s. Porpora is rooming with his good buddy Metastasio, who is the legendary librettist and the librettist of 18th century opera. So there's all kinds of connections. I mean, Haydn as Porpora's apprentice would have been he would have seen all the top musicians, composers, patrons in Vienna at that time. There's even stories that he, when he's playing, he was accompanying Porpora, and Gluck even encouraged Haydn to continue in music and composition. So he's meeting all kinds of famous people during that time. And then he starts to get famous patronage. So Baron Fürnberg is like the first one. And then there's Count Morzin, who becomes Kapellmeister for Count Morzin, who's also in Vienna. But the court actually collapses, it goes bankrupt. And he can't afford to have an orchestra anymore, and he can't afford to have music. But through that engagement with the Count Morzin, which probably ended around 1761, then he gets the reference to the Esterházy family. And then they hire him as the vice Kapellmeister until about 1766, when he becomes promoted to full Kapellmeister, when the previous one fully retired. The quartet, the gap between the quartets is because of all that professional activity. And after, he's composing symphonies and occasional pieces, stuff for church services, and then, of course, famously also baritone trios, which Prince Nicholas Esterházy was a big performer of this instrument called the baritone. He wanted Haydn to compose them. So he was composing all these other genres of music. And then finally in 1769, we don't know why, but he returns to the string quartet. And then those quartets become sort of like almost like the first mature quartets, because his first quartets are like initial pieces. And then there's this whole career that happens, all this experience, more composition with symphonies, great orchestras, great musicians around him. And then 1769 to 1772, there's these group of threes, Opus 9, Opus 17, Opus 20 quartets that are just fantastic. Then there's another 9-year gap. And in 1781, he composes Opus 33, which others argue are the first sort of classical quartets for their sort of use of supposedly different use of four voices in a sort of classical or galant texture. So yeah, that's the story of the quartets. I don't say that Opus 20 is more important than any of the other ones. I just think there's three distinct periods of the first sort of three groups of quartets, and they're all great for various reasons.
Let's talk about Porpora as well. Do we know more than that quote that we know? We know the time frame. He gave a few quotes about working with him and the kind of how tough Porpora was. He was kind of hard on him, but he did learn the fundamentals. And beyond that, do we know anything else from his Italian connection?
So Haydn. There's this sort of another thing that we get from the early biographies is that Haydn was a singer as a little boy. And so he was recruited to go to Vienna to study in St. Stephen's to become a choir boy. And he did that. And at the same time, he did receive musical training. So from the ages of about 6 to 18, he was there. He then around 18, lost his voice. And
just really quickly, Professor Birson, the type of music he would be singing, were these masses? Are these church, all the different liturgical services and everything to do with the Catholic? So this is mainly church, right? Not secular.
Correct.
Okay.
It's all church.
Do we know what kind of, like the type of composers he might have sung?
That I'm not sure about.
Okay. What year is it? Because he was born in the 30s, right? 1730s?
1732.
Okay.
So 1750, really on the dot, we can say that his freelance career began. So after 18 years old, he then basically is on the streets in Vienna, and he winds up living in this attic. And he says that I played on this worm-eaten clavier, but I wouldn't trade that for any of the king's treasures in the world. Something to that effect.
And Vienna, what type of city musically was Vienna at that point?
Oh, that was the center of the musical world. I mean, all the big people, whether Gluck was there, Metastasio was living there.
So not Italy, not Paris. Vienna was probably
there's various capitals where there's big composers, right? But of course, Vienna's kind of at the cusp of what's going to become, this high classical period with Haydn as the sort of first person. But he wasn't really the first person. There's lots of people in Vienna at that time who are adding to this musical mix. And so it was one of the big capitals. And then with Haydn, and then followed by Haydn, Mozart, who wanted to come to Vienna, and then Beethoven, who wanted to come to Vienna. I mean, Vienna was really a central hub. And it was a great one because it was a place where lots of the different styles of the various musical capitals, were sort of, it's like a melting pot of all those styles. Italian masters were there, German masters were there, French masters were there, and that's, you see really a lot of all of the different elements. I mean, even eventually Turkish music gets into the Viennese classical, right. With, Mozart pieces.
Yeah.
So it really is a center for music, and one that becomes probably the most important one by the end of the 18th century.
This is good to tie with your research because you talk about the early piano sonatas that you wrote. Can you first explain to me, what is a da capo aria? What does that mean?
Well, the da capo, that's a form, standard form that would be in Italian operas in the early 18th century. And it's It means that there's a sort of an A section and then a B section contrasting, and then the A section returns. So da capo. But what's interesting is in the A section, the first A section would modulate, much like a sonata form modulation. What later will become sonata form modulation. So the first A section would modulate to the key of the dominant or the relative major if it's in minor. And then when the A section returns da capo, it has to resolve that back to the original tonic.
Okay.
So that's sort of where we get these proto dramatic recapitulations or recapitulatory strategies.
Do they modulate to the dominant key often?
Yes.
Okay.
The dominant key or the relative major if it's in minor mode.
Ah, I see. Okay. And is that pretty common, like the most common way to go?
Well, yes, in those days, absolutely.
Okay. So
It's
you
the
wouldn't
only
see
way.
unusual modulations?
No.
Okay. And so how does this tie with his piano sonatas and the early ones?
Well, the early ones, I find that a lot of the piano sonatas and also basically a lot of the instrumental music that Haydn composed in those days followed a lot of that same design. And especially when you get into the return, there were a few, this scholar Charles Rosen categorized a few of the options that composers would use in the second A section when returning to the original key. And so the A section might begin with the main theme in the dominant, and then restate that theme in the tonic, and then remain in that key for the rest of the exposition, for the rest of the return of the A section. And so I found that Haydn's the second half, like say the development section through the end of the recapitulation, followed exactly that harmonic strategy. And so you really see there the way that the form of the da capo aria, especially the return to the A section at the end of the da capo aria, maps onto, in fact, informs the second half, the development section and the recapitulation of the sonata form. Could you say that these are like little instrumental operas?
I think they are. Yeah, I think that's exactly what the sonata aesthetic is. I mean, if you look at, it's more obvious in slow movements because in slow movements, like say it's second or third movement of a 4-movement piece, sometimes the second movement of a 3-movement piece, with respect to these early works, it's really as if there's a singer on the stage. So the left hand of the keyboard is like the orchestra, and they're plunking away these chords, and then the right hand is the singer, the soprano. In string quartets, it's like the lower 3 strings are like the orchestra, and the first violin is the soprano, and it's blatantly obvious in the slow movements. But I think the thing that's so great about early 18th century opera is how the music, like dynamics, register, scales, different melodic shapes, are used dramatically. Right? You might hear some text about a stormy sea reflecting the storminess in my heart, stuff like that. And the music does that, and then, there will be the plays with cadences where before you'll make a cadence, all of a sudden you'll jump up, an octave and then redo the whole process. It's very procedural and very sonata-like. I think that's where I pull that from, is that the sonata form, I think, developed with an operatic aesthetic in mind, the idea of using music to represent drama. It's just that with the sonata form, it becomes, you don't need the text anymore, but the music is very dramatic. And I think that the dramatic feel of sonata form pieces in Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, CPE, Bach before them is taken directly from opera.
Okay, so I have 2 questions, and it deals with, the first one is, okay, you mentioned Charles Rosen. I haven't read his book. I know he's very famous. He wrote a book on sonata form. Is that the
controversial?
Exactly. So could you give me, someone who's never really looked at his work, an overview on him and what he says that you find is still relevant or maybe has changed with our new information or as scholarship has progressed?
Oh, well, I think, there's 2 main areas I feel that Rosen is impactful. It's his sonata forms book, which the story, my graduate advisor, James Webster, was friends with Charles Rosen, told the story that
the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians asked Charles Rosen to write the entry on sonata form. But he refused to because he said that sonata form is not one thing. So he wrote this book in response, Sonata Forms. And that's why in the New Grove, he actually recommended that James Webster write the entry for sonata form in the New Grove. So that's why James Webster is the author for that. And that's why this book exists. I personally find that book to be central in my understanding of what sonata form is. It informs a lot of the way that I think about it. So I just think that the Sonata Forms book is really great because it shows the ways that the different forms from coming out of the Baroque period all influenced the way that sonata form developed. So that to me is a central book, and I think it doesn't get much interest these days because of the prominence or the predominance of the Hepakovsky and Darcy's elements of sonata theory, which everyone focuses on now. But they've forgotten, I think, about Rosen, and I think Rosen needs to be taken more seriously on that front. The other book that was really important for a long time was Classical Style. And I think that one has become subject to a lot of criticism because a lot of things that he says. First of all, one of the things that he says is that Haydn came on the scene like Malherbe to correct the mannerist style of C.P.E. Bach. so C.P.E. Bach is known for these dramatic modulations, and so or just surprise elements in the music because he's working with
his C.P.E. Bach like Sturm und Drang. Is that what he's supposed to be?
Not Sturm und Drang, but Empfindsamkeit.
Okay.
Which is kind of like, emotion or feeling or drama in music. And so Sturm und Drang is actually a literary movement that was sort of parallel to this time.
Okay.
And so people have tried to connect the two, but it's debatable. But C.P. Bach's surprise modulations or moving to remote keys would happen in ways in the form that weren't justified by it. But then Rosen says Haydn's surprise modulations are justified by the form, generated by it, and then resolved by it. Stuff like that.
Well, didn't Haydn, I read in his biography, he loved some suite or some set of sonatas that C.P.E. Bach wrote, right? He played them over and over, something like that. So he was definitely influenced by C.P.E. Bach.
Definitely. We don't know which ones they were, whether they were the Württemberg sonatas or the Prussian sonatas, because both of those were composed by the time that Haydn would have done that. Because again, he's saying that he did it when he was a young man freelancing and he was playing through, and then he became influenced by C.P.E. Bach. Another story is that he found Bach's a textbook. He was looking for a theory textbook in Vienna, and then he found C.P.E. Bach's Versuch. But again, we don't know when that might have happened exactly.
And they knew each other, right? Because I think he said that...
Yes, C.P. Bach lived into the 1780s, and they knew of each other's work, absolutely. And they even... Haydn was criticized in Berlin, where C.P. Bach was working for a long time, for his sort of mixing of styles, like comic style with sacred style. And so he was criticized quite a lot in Berlin for that, but C.P. Bach came to the defense of Haydn, and they always wrote that they respected each other.
Right. Okay. So, the second question I had was, you've written about the fact that undergraduates get a distorted view of sonata form. So what is that distorted view, and what should be something that replaces that?
Well, I kind of agree with Rosen in that there's not a real thing there's no such thing as sonata form. The distorted view comment comes from the way that Beethoven became a model for a definition of sonata form in the 19th century. So this is the century after the one where this music is developing. And I think that this idea of a clear exposition with a first theme and then a second theme which is lyrical, and then the development section and the recapitulation, all of those strict sort of formal units that are still the basis of the definition of sonata form in undergraduate classrooms. is one that again seeks to venerate the music of Beethoven and codify it. But if you look at sonata forms by Haydn, for example, they're very different. And even Beethoven's sonata forms are just very. There's so much variety in them. I really think that we don't need so much more terminology. You can look to binary forms, ternary forms, da capo arias, and you can see how all of these sort of formal elements work in the sonata form. So we call it sonata form. Okay, we can do that, but there is also this famous sort of musicological debate in the 1980s whether it's sonata form or sonata style. I still think that sonata style is a better term, because it's a way of dramatizing what I consider to be basically a rounded binary form. So we don't need all this terminology. We don't need EECs or MCs or S's or P zones or whatever. We need just there's the A section and a B section with a rounded. We have cadences, yeah.
It's
we have
very
themes,
much like
yeah.
modern music. I mean, contemporary music. You have A sections, B sections.
Yeah. So now you'll have conversations among music theorists where it's like, oh, the EEC is declined because the P wasn't fully realized. It's like we're speaking a different language all of a sudden. It's like, let's take a couple of steps back.
Can I ask you about his piano sonatas, and does he have early periods, middle periods, late periods? He wrote quite a lot of them, right? I mean, over 40, something like that? Were they all for amateurs, or were there some that reached the virtuoso level?
Yes. So just the beginning ones are really for the amateurs, because he famously says that he's had to eke out a wretched existence as a music teacher. So the ones that I kind of focused on in my presentation were the 9 early sonatas, where we don't know exactly the dates of their composition, but just because of the timing of them and what Haydn was doing at those times, and working also with Porpora, we sort of think that those were composed in the 1750s for students. Then there's works that are in the 1760s and 1770s, and Haydn is composing now for more like court musicians or patrons with like more access to virtuosity. So things like there's the famous C, I think it's Opus 20, the C minor sonata, which is just a beautiful piece. And then there's even later in the 1780s and 1790s, he's writing for like full-on virtuosos.
Was he a virtuoso? Did he play the piano at a high level?
I don't think he played any instrument at a virtuoso level, but he played violin, viola, and clavier. He composed and improvised at the clavier.
Right. Okay.
So, but I think that he was really more of a composer, and he could obviously play these instruments, but I don't think that he was. He even played in his own string quartets, but I don't think that he would have considered himself a performer. But I can imagine Haydn improvising at the piano or at the clavier in the mornings. That was his routine.
So he put in a morning stretch then, practicing.
Oh yeah, and I can just imagine what how amazing that must have been. That's one thing that I wish if I could go back in time and just watch something.
Well,
it would be
I have some fun questions for you at the end, so we'll get there. Don't worry. Okay. So I want to just get into it now with some of the technical stuff. You've looked at his music in depth, the scores and everything, and there has been a question about voice leading. So does he have an Italian style to him?
I think so. I think it's fair to say that there's a kind of Italian, and I think that there's even a Partimento counterpoint. I mean, I think that some people thought that was a little strange, but when I mentioned that, but I'll put it this way: there's two kind of major contrapuntal schools going on that I think in Haydn is one is Fuchs, and Haydn he taught composition students, and even famously Beethoven, using Fuchs, which is species counterpoint, right? But then when you look at the music, I always felt that there was a disconnect. I never could quite map stuff from Fuchs onto actual music from that period by Haydn, by Mozart, by Beethoven. People might say that you can break things down into first species or second species relationships, but it's still, I mean, Fuchs was modal counterpoint. Fuchs was actually trying to teach the counterpoint of Palestrina. He created this method for that. So it's kind of like Renaissance counterpoint. Whereas, and you get these, like at the end of every exercise, you get these 6/8 cadences. Pieces are composed in modes in species counterpoint, and so it's not major minor tonality. And so I think it's totally fair to say that counterpoint isn't this universal necessarily concept. I think intervals are. Sure, intervals are like this fundamental thing. It's like an element of music, right? An interval. But I think that when you start to see different patterns emerge, and this is where Robert Gjerdingen's work becomes so important. You see printers, or we can call them anything. We call them flag. We can call them book.
Right.
It doesn't matter what you call them, but they're patterns that emerge. And I think that that's fair to say that if you want to create, and I think it's a Neapolitan style. Neapolitan Partimento counterpoint is one that favors these certain things, and these are things that we see all in Haydn's music. And I think that that's really I think that there's an Italian. I think it's more than Italian. It's Neapolitan counterpoint style. I think that's the whole point of what's going on with these studies in Partimento and in schema theory.
Right. Can we give some examples of schema that you've found, and maybe people can just reference them? And I would love to see where they're so clear as day, 18th century examples of schema. Yeah.
Well, so for example, there's the first Haydn keyboard sonata, Hoboken 1, Hoboken 16, number 1. And in the slow movement of that, the second movement, you get this tonic pedal, and then above it, you get the figures. You can add the figures 3/5, and then it goes 4/6 back to 3/5. And Robert Gjerdingen calls it the hearts, or I think it might have been John Rice who after the fact calls it the hearts. And then right off of that, it goes into a printer. And then there's a cadence. And so, I mean, right there, you see it. In Haydn's second keyboard sonata, which actually I think was composed probably later, probably in the 1760s. It also has, there's this sort of generic beginning. I'm not of the opinion that you need to assign a schema to every single measure of music. But there is this beginning that's on B flat major, and then it goes right into another printer cadence. And then from there, you get this sort of like rule of the octave. Or I should say there's a transition, and it uses the 5/6, extending 5/6 pattern, and goes into a half cadence. And then right off the half cadence, you get Fenaroli's, you get Indugios. It's all over the place. Those are just these two keyboard sonata examples that I can think of, but they're everywhere. They're everywhere. Every piece has them.
Can we talk about Robert Kimmerling, one of Haydn's students, being recommended an opera by Baldassare Galuppi for study?
Right. Well, this was something that I found in H.C. Robbins' Landon. He has a whole thing, Haydn's Life and Works, Chronicles of Haydn's Life and Works. And so in the early years, we know that Haydn was teaching, and Robert Kimmerling, I don't know much about the person, but I know that he was a student of Haydn's, and that he reports that Haydn recommended this opera by Baldassare Galuppi to study, because really, I think that Italian opera and Italian opera, comic opera especially, that was what was in style, what was in fashion. So he said, you should look at that piece to come up with how to compose.
Haydn composed a mass every year to celebrate the name day of the Prince of Esterházy's wife. What I found really interesting was that these masses kind of set a tradition, and later on Beethoven found himself having been commissioned to write a mass for the prince. And apparently with Beethoven, it did not go well. And according to an anecdote, Beethoven's mass wasn't well received. The prince wasn't happy. Hummel apparently was laughing at the fiasco. Beethoven was furious. Now, but the main thing is, I just want to talk about how well Haydn's masses were appreciated and what a standard, what a high standard they set.
Well, I think it's not only masses. I think anything that Haydn composed. I mean, you have to remember when he went to London, he composed the symphonies, and they were a huge hit.
Right.
His Paris symphonies, any piece that he composed for anybody, he always famously he would take the performers and the audience into consideration, and he would compose something just for them. So that must be one of the. I mean, it's partly Haydn's personality that comes across in the music.
How did he get so good? How did he get so good? I mean, that's such a broad question, but we know he studied so hard. What do we know? What's in the secret sauce?
Well, I think the way that I might describe it is, this idea of what Kant talks about genius in the 18th century. And genius isn't necessarily something that is skill-based or intellect-based. It's all about soul and having your soul come through in the music. And I think that that's what Haydn's music really does above anything else. There's just some power of his personality that he was able to express through notes played by instruments written on a page. And they just, when you listen to it, or when you look at a score, or when you play through these pieces, that's what jumps off at you. Okay, and I think that's what Mozart had, that's what Beethoven had also. But something just, Haydn was just so part of his success, I think, is the way that he was so gracious to any and everybody. I mean, we just to go back to the Mozart comment from before. I mean, maybe even if he didn't mean it literally, he was saying it to Mozart about Mozart. You know, he wanted Mozart to know that he appreciated that, and that's kind of what Mozart needed to hear, also, right? So Haydn, I think his great talent was being sort of a conduit of himself through music. Even at the end of his life, he says, "I am just a living clavier." I think that really sums up the secret. Okay, he embodied music, and music embodied him.
Okay, but then let's be honest, he is kind of a caricature, right? Because now, I'm not sure if this is a mainstream opinion, but Haydn is the witty joker. He's the trickster. He's just there to crack jokes. Right. He's not as serious as he's not the genius. And I remember in music history class, the teacher would play Haydn's, of course, his Surprise Symphony. We get to the surprise, everyone laughs, and then we move on. We never talk. Right. We never talk about what a serious, full-blooded composer he was. And so,
that's unfortunate.
Can we talk about how his perception has kind of become like a joker?
Right. Well, I think that he was. I think this is one of the things that also Rosen. The main point, I think, of the classical style that Rosen does get across is how serious Haydn was with the music. And one of the great analyses is of Haydn's Opus 50 String Quartet No. 1, where it's in B flat major, and it begins with a pulsing quarter note, B flat in the cello. And then, the upper strings come in on top of it. And then that pulsing quarter note, it's a quarter note on B flat. It's just happening. Okay, that's as minimal as you get. But that becomes the lifeblood of the whole piece. You can hear it then pass up into the second violin, up into the first violin, into the viola. It's just such a remarkable thing that this one pulsing quarter note can become something that dramatizes a piece of music that speaks to you. So I recommend anybody who wants to get a sense of Haydn's genius coming through music. That would be one piece, is Opus 50 No. 1, the first movement. Again, I think it's partly he did have a sense of humor, obviously, and I do think also that you have to remember that people often are playing the music in chamber ensembles. Like there's these amateur societies, right? People with means, middle class people, have instruments, they're studying, and one of the things that develops over the course of the century is, getting a subscription to notation of new compositions by people like Haydn. Haydn was really one of the pioneers in the music publishing industry. And so it was exciting to get your hands on the latest string quartets by Haydn. And so there's the Opus 33 number 2 is the joke quartets, right? Because it never ends, the fourth movement. But think about how funny and charming that must have been if, say, you and I were both in a quartet, right? And we have two other friends, and we get this score, and then we start playing through it, and then we realize that the piece doesn't want to end, right? It must have been a lot of fun, right? And I think that's part of what Haydn wanted to do. He wanted to entertain people. He wanted to keep it light.
And he was a savvy businessman, right? He knew he'd been poor for so long. He said,
absolutely. I think, in some ways, Mozart was too talented and Beethoven was too angsty, right?
Yep.
But Haydn kind of had this sweet spot,
right,
where he was just very popular across all social classes and across all, styles of music. He really did manage to capture the essence of the Enlightenment in Vienna.
Do you know anything about his brother, Michael Haydn?
Not very much, but you should talk to Michael Ruling, who is the Michael Haydn expert. Because Michael Haydn actually was a great composer as well. But I have to confess, I don't know too much about.
That's okay. That's okay.
His life.
We can't know it all. So now This is important because now you can educate people on what to listen to Haydn, because he has composed so much. Anything that stands out that you can give a nice commentary on?
One of my favorite piano sonatas is the Hoboken 16 number 20 in C minor. It is the thing to look out for. That one is in the exposition. There's this as we sort of are modulating into the second key, there's this climactic, almost recitative like moment with this big fermata on this dominant ninth chord, and then it continues on from there. So that one has just a lot of pathos in it, and I think that it really reflects the influence of opera and drama in the sonata style. Another one, which is a really famous example, is the Symphony Number 45. It's the F sharp minor, the Farewell Symphony.
Okay.
And of course, the famous story in that one is in the final movement, right? So the court had been staying way too long at Esterházy, the palace, which is far outside the city center of Vienna, where many of the musicians lived during the year with their families. So they would go summer in the palace, but the summer turned into September, October, November, and they were getting kind of anxious. They wanted to leave.
Right.
And so Haydn composed this symphony for the prince to hear, and the big message was in the final movement. The players sort of one by one leave the stage. And that's a really beautiful, I think, sort of symphonic expression. And the prince got the hint, and it worked. So that's a great one. As far as like the string quartets are just great. And I think that the sort of Opus 9, Opus 17, and Opus 20, any of the string quartets from those three opus sets are just, they're just beautiful glimpses of what little universes the string quartets could become. And I think, each one is a little different from the other. Opus 9 and Opus 17, they're kind of, I think, more operatic in ways, more dramatic. They're almost like little stages where like puppet theater, where these performers get to interact with one another in these little scenes. And in Opus 20, you get, of course, the fugues at the end. So that is another great example. But then 10 years later, for Opus 33, Opus 33 is a sort of, Haydn famously wrote on the front of them that they're sort of, or a letter to his publisher, that they're composed in a new and a special style. And
are these the Russian quartets?
Right. And so, again, those names come after the fact. But another one that came after the joke with this Opus 33 number 2, for people who want to get Haydn's humor, the fourth movement of Opus 33 number 2 is a good moment. And the joke is that, you don't know when it's going to end. the ending is the beginning is the ending, and so there's kind of like this awkward thing that happens at the end of the. Also, not to leave out vocal music, the creation, the oratorios. Yeah, his oratorios and his masses. Okay, so in terms of, so there's the sort of 18th century Enlightenment gentleman, but there's also the devout Catholic.
Right.
And the creation is just, this expression in the beginning of musical expression of nothingness coming into being formed, right? And then God said, "Let there be light," and there's this sort of C minor, C major contrast. So that is something that I think everybody should be familiar with. And then one of my favorite pieces, the most powerful, I think that this is, I think, of an expression on the power of, like, how Bach just sort of gives you his religion and all of his music, and you really feel it. The Haydn Lord Nelson Mass. That is just the most powerful mass. And I think Haydn's devoutness comes through in that. I mean, you almost feel the fear of God in that one.
He's composed for so long. Did he have a point where he said, okay, now he's no longer like a young composer. Everything from this point on is very mature. It's a professional work. Or do we get that sense even from the very beginning that he had a high standard from the beginning?
Yeah,
when did he find his feet is my question. Yeah,
there's this sort of narrative that has gone around that James Webster, I think, has done a lot to debunk. But that, with the Opus 33 quartets in 1781, he became a classical composer.
He finally got it.
Yeah, right. That he finally got it.
Yeah.
I don't see that. I mean, the more that I study, I just feel like he had it from the beginning. I just see the same thing that in these early piano sonatas and I would find in the later pieces. I just think that there's different phases of his life. And so we also have to remember, like, the idea of the society, what who he's working with, who he's interacting with, the people, his audience. These are all factors that we have to take into account. And I think that he, at each stage, reflected that. So it's not necessarily his development, but more him and the sort of the society he was exposed to, that the society's development at the same time that you really see in his music. So, these early sonatas that were written for, keyboard students or students in composition. Then you get some early string symphonies written for Count Mortzin. You get the early string quartets written for Baron Frumberg. Those, have their own unique qualities. And I think every stage of the way, Haydn just perfectly, he's like a painter, right? He perfectly captures the subject that he's writing for every single time. Then there's the Esterházy days. Okay, so lots of music there, but symphonies, chamber ensembles, basically the musicians that he had at his disposal at that time. So his music then starts to change. Operas in the 1770s, it's more of the same. 1780s, he becomes kind of like a freelance musician again. He's still working at the court, but he's allowed to publish. He's allowed to publish his music, and so again, that's how he's a pioneer in the music publishing industry. But at the same time, now he's getting outside of the Esterházy court, and now he's getting internationally famous. So these works, the works from the 1780s and afterwards, are just more open, more international. Then there's the London symphonies, the Paris symphonies. Each one reflects, I think, a different stage in the sort of rising arc of a career.
You mentioned in the article that you had when I interviewed you earlier, you mentioned that Porpora had a style that was perhaps more ornate, an older style, and Haydn had a more cleaner, more, I guess, simplified. But Haydn, he wrote fugues in the final sections of his string quartets. He was an expert in counterpoint. And so how does that gel with his image of being this very light, this light composer for light music when he's still writing fugues?
Right. Well, for the fugues are a little bit controversial actually in this respect. So the idea is that well, let's take the string quartet as an example. Okay, this is again going back to one of the things that Rosen says. The idea of classical counterpoint is you have a simple galant texture of a melodic voice and a bass, but you have four parts. So the bass and the melody are constructed in such a way that they can be interchangeable. And so not only are they interchangeable, so the bass can become a melody and the melody can become a bass, but those parts can then pass into the inner voices as well. And so it's a matter of the performers, the voices in the music, getting a kind of agency, getting a kind of a personality. And I might be able to then plug my friend Edward Clorman's book, Multiple Agency in Mozart's Music. I think that's the title of it, or Agency. I think that's spot on. It's a way of using kind of like a two-voice structure, but doing it in such a way that all four parts, or however many parts there are, get a kind of an agency in the process. And the way to do that is really to not have a bass sound so much like only a bass, or a melody sound only like a melody. And again, that Opus 50 number 1 example is a good one, because the bass is a pulsing quarter note, but that pulsing quarter note then passes through the ensemble. And sometimes sounds like a melody. So, it's a certain point where you can't tell the difference. And then the whole thing just becomes this breathing, pulsing, like a jukebox kind of a thing. Like this, the thing just pulses a quarter note, and that's what you get. And all the instruments have a chance to participate in this sort of interweaving texture.
Do we know anything of Haydn, the music teacher? We know he taught Beethoven and a few people. How did he teach? What was the way that he imparted knowledge?
Good question. I think, one thing that we do know is that he used Fuchs. I still don't know why, but because it just, to me, it doesn't map itself out in the actual music. I mean, to me, it would have made more sense had he said that he had learned the fundamentals from Porpora. The Partimento type patterns are all over his music. Schemata are all over his music. And yet he taught using Fuchs. It would have made more sense if he took some solfeggi from Porpora and taught with them. But I always found that to be fascinating. Like, that's one detail in the whole history of this that I can't quite resolve. So yeah, he taught with Fuchs. He taught Beethoven with Fuchs. I mean, we have the counterpoint exercises. Now, as far as being a teacher, the other evidence we have are the early piano sonatas, because in those days, piano teachers were also composers and performers were also composers. There wasn't so much of a disconnect between those things. It was more of an organic thing. So Haydn would compose a piece of music for student to practice. And so those are the things I was sort of getting at that with my article on Haydn and the Da Capo aria. He was teaching through composing in those early days. But then he didn't do as much teaching because he became a Kapellmeister. So then his music becomes more tailored for the virtuoso performers that he had at his disposal.
He said that he was forced to be original. What do you think he meant by that?
He did say that, and I think it's kind of has to do with the isolation of working in the Esterházy court, as opposed to, say, being more of that international figure that he was later on. So he's crediting the fact that he was kind of isolated. The Esterházys were sort of connected to Vienna, but also living outside of it. And, he had this great orchestra. He had an opera house eventually at his disposal. I mean, he had everything he could possibly needed and wanted as a composer, just that he was kind of in the sticks, if you will. Like, I'm just using the analogy, like, instead of living in Manhattan, you're living out in, like, New Jersey somewhere. You're close, but you're not exactly there, and you're kind of isolated. So I think that isolation was kind of what he was referring to, that he was able to try out things, or he was kind of forced to do things on his own, make decisions on his own, without, say, being too influenced by popular trends in the big city.
You've expressed some concerns about kind of the way some theories of form are being discussed. What do you think of schema in terms of form? Can we use schema, for instance, in his late works? I mean, obviously in his early works, we see a lot of those patterns. But even in his later works, do you think the schema is relevant even for his later works, his like the creation, the seasons? Do we see schema in all of those things?
Well, I think we do. It's just that, again, so my whole sort of reservation about the way we discuss form, I think is also true for the potential for what schema can become. It can become like this own meta language where, if I say printer, only you and I know what we're talking about. And I think that's kind of dangerous. And I some people also, like I said, they try to find some kind of a schema in every note of every measure. And I think that's a little bit misguided. You don't have to always find that. I think, things like the rule of the octave, the bass motions, and then the different, the schemata that Gjerdingen has identified, those things are ubiquitous for sure. But I think that's really not the ultimate goal of musical expression. I think that whole idea of originality, right? The idea of genius being in embodying the music with your spirit and having the music embody you. I think that's really the most important thing. So I think it's the expression. I mean, the idea of the creation and how it's achieved through musical means. I think that's the most important part. And I don't think you would find any schema necessarily there. But just as being kind of like the rules of the grammar of the day, I think that's where you would find that they're ubiquitous and you can spot them all over the place. But I would hesitate then to sort of assign this kind of omnipotent power to schemata or partimento.
Final question, because I really want to get to the Turkish classical music. I want to just ask you about music education. You're a professor and you're kind of living through this Partimento kind of wave that's going on. How do you see music education changing, adapting? How do you see the landscape for music education changing in the next 5-10 years?
Well, I hope it changes. I'm a little bit discouraged, to be honest with you, because I would have thought that Partimento and schema theory would have been more widely adopted. It doesn't seem to be. I feel like, at least with respect to like music theorists, it seems still to be kind of a fringe topic. It's becoming more popular thanks to things like what you're doing and all of the great professors that are doing research on it.
So you're saying it'll take a couple more years before it really hits mainstream? Yeah,
and I still think that there's resistance to it, to be honest with you. I don't think that I think there's a lot of mainstream music theory is still kind of dealing with these approaches using Roman numerals and functional harmony, and I just see that like that's so embedded in the way that everything is done that it's going to be hard to get off of it. And like I said, there's even resistance to Partimento and schema theory. And again, we kind of have to keep those two things different, right? The Partimento is the actual, pedagogical exercises, and then schema theory is kind of the thing that I feel assigns different patterns to them. Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure what's going to happen in the next few years. I think that more people outside of universities are getting interested in it, which I think is great. I think there's a community on Facebook which is just growing.
Have you seen a change in the last maybe 3 years? Maybe a spike in the last couple of years?
Yes, I would say outside of university, a lot of it is in Europe. But in the American institutions, I think, are just kind of stuck. And there's this sort of crisis. They're sort of using social justice now as a one thing to sort of get at the old way of doing things. But I think it's just mostly just like it's a stale model. It doesn't get you anywhere. All it does is have you produce analyses of music using functional harmony and the theories that arose from it. It's just kind of stuck there, But like I said, in Europe, I'm seeing all kinds of people doing academic work on Partimento and Schema theory, and lots of people that are composers, that are musicians, that are not necessarily academic music theorists, are really, yes, I've seen a huge spike in that the last few years. I'd say that's the most exciting thing. And there's lots of people doing things on what they call public music theory, so YouTube channels, communities on Facebook, stuff that you're doing, I think is wonderful. It just getting the word out and making these things accessible and available to people so that they can, really enjoy practicing music in a way that I think is conducive to musical expression, musical existence. I mean, we want to be able to improvise, right? We don't want to just play notes on pages of stuff that we've analyzed using Roman numerals and get stuck in that sort of playing only the same masterworks kind of a mentality. We want to be able to keep it alive and be able to manipulate the music with our own personality, our own geniuses.
Well said. Now, in the last question I have, it now deals with your interest and your expertise in classical Turkish music. And please, I know nothing about it, but I'm very interested in that. And please tell me about it and an overview of it for me and my audience.
Well, that became an interest of mine because of my family. I'm Turkish. And so I was going through music school and, studying all about Haydn, and that was wonderful. But I also, Haydn doesn't have the same kind of a name that I do, or Beethoven either. Those are all German guys. And so I always thought, well, what if I started looking into things with my family? And so I found the Turkish oud is the instrument that I play.
But you're a pianist, right? Is that your main instrument?
I'm a pianist, yes, but I wouldn't say it's my main instrument anymore. The oud has become my main instrument. But piano I've been playing since much longer, since I was a child. Yeah, and I just kept studying it, and I got more interested in
what does it mean by classical Turkish? Is that like the traditional style does it have its kind of its own institution? Kind of, I think of Indian classical music as Carnatic music. Is there like a lineage there that stretches for centuries?
Yes, it goes back. Really, the most recent sort of court patronage was in the Ottoman court, and so a lot of
what
it is
century
Ottoman
is that?
music. So Ottomans are 1300 to 1919.
Okay.
Yeah, it's 600 years, and music really developed there, but it was also going on at the same time in Arabic courts and also in Iran. So when we say Arabic music, Iranian music, Turkish music, it's kind of all the same general tradition. There's just these variants like between those three sort of cultures, but
kind of like Western classical music and the different countries in Europe.
I really think it's analogous to that. Yes. Nowadays, though, because of all the nationalism and all the sort of stuff that goes on with politics, you don't really think of them as the same unified tradition. But I think it really is. And there's also Greek Orthodox music in there. There's a lot of Jewish music. I mean, it's a really diverse tradition, and I think it's all about geography. And what's great about the geography of the Middle East is that you're sort of this passing through, or this sort of central hub between Western Europe and also India, Pakistan, and also even further east into China and Japan. So you'll get one of the groups I play with is Eurasia Concert, and we do these sort of Silk Road concerts because it's great because you play music from Japan, music from ancient China, music from India, right. And then you see. I've learned so much from that. I just see so many of the names of the modes. By the way, the Makam system is the modal system that is used.
Okay,
that's how everything's organized.
What is that?
That is a great question. Well, it's a system of music. Okay, it's a way of organizing music, and it's commonly referred to as modal. So really, it's melodic. There's only one line. It's not polyphonic, and you get these kind of. There's hundreds of potential modes, but it's combinations of different melodies that are put together that can form a mode. So I can put it this way: there's there's a kind of a pitch collection, which is kind of like the major scale in Western music. It's actually the same kind of a collection that we have in Turkish music. And each one of the notes of the scale, kind of like in the Western modes, can be a final or a tonic note of the mode. So you might have a melody on like the C of C major, right? And the melody will rise from C and then fall from C back to C using the notes of that particular scale. And then you'll say you're in the C mode, and we call that rast. So it's a modal system, and then you can what's beautiful about it is you can have both those original modes, which are on each of the notes of the scale, or you can combine two notes. So one of them could be like the E note, the third note of the scale, going to the first note of the scale, and each one of them has a modal center. And so when you combine those two, you get this beautiful mode.
Is it tempered equally, like 12 notes, or is it microtones?
Well, microtonal, I think, yes, it's microtonal. But again, microtonal even is a term that I'm sort of, it sort of mystifies the whole concept a little bit too much. It's music. I mean, they're notes on the scale. And so equal tempered music in the major scale now that we play on the keyboard, that is out of tune compared to Turkish music. And also according to physics, right? The laws of sound, we have to sort of manipulate the intervals to be able to play in all the keys. But they're not so manipulated that it sounds out of tune, right? But in Turkish music, when you play, because we're not concerned with having equal intervals in all keys, we're not using intervals, we're not using chords, we're using individual melody lines, then they focus more on the pure intonation. So a third will be exactly, 5-4 or whatever, 4 or 5. Yeah, pure. So I think the most analogous way to talk about it is just intonation. It's like a major scale with just intonation. And each of the notes of the scale is a potential tonic in a mode, what we call makam.
How many modes are there?
So that's what I was going to say. There's plenty. I mean, there's a few that are used way more commonly nowadays.
My thing is, what would a typical song form be like? And is there improvisation? And what does a typical tune look like?
So there's different forms, just like in Western music. And I think also like the idea of measure and phrase is quite analogous. So you'll get 8 measure phrases that make sections in a song form. The most common or popular song form nowadays is called the şarkı, which is you have like an opening line, which we'll call the A section, and you get a refrain, which is the B section, and then you get the C section, which is kind of like the climax, goes up to like the melodic high point, and then might explore some other. It might modulate to another makam at that point, but then it returns to the B section. So there's this rhetoric you have to get from the makam and the high point that you went to in the C section, and you have to convincingly get back. And often it can be quite clever the way the composers get back to that original makam for the return of the B section. So it's A, B, C, B. And that's the şarkı form or the song form. It's popular.
Can you recommend like famous, like famous music in Turkish that really should be the first stop at least, like oh, you got to check this out because this was a famous composer or this is a famous song or something like that?
Oh yeah, well it also has a history that parallels that of the sort of European courts. So Itri, Itri. His first name is Mustafa. Last name is Itri, Itri. And he's kind of like Turkish or the Ottoman Bach. And
the Ottoman Bach, that's awesome.
Yeah. Then there's so the Ottoman Beethoven is Dede Efendi, Dedefendi, Dede Efendi. Dede means like grandpa, Efendi is like sir. So he's like, Papa, whatever, Papa Haydn. And let's see. Yeah, any composition really by him is definitely worth. He's really famous for writing songs.
What is like the Symphony No. 5 in classical Turkish music? Like every Turk would, oh yeah, we know that one. Yeah, everyone knows that one.
Well, yeah. So okay, so the whirling dervishes actually are a huge cultural thing in Turkey still, and in the Ottoman times they certainly were. And so any ceremony by the whirling dervishes is like Turkish opera, because you have all like this sort of Islamic philosophy, and all of the poetry is taken either from the Quran or from Rumi, or from other Sufi poets. So it's very mystical, very spiritual music, and the poems will be selected in particular ways. So it's like an oratorio, and the music is just so reflective of that, and it goes through such incredible modulations of different modes, different makams, that that's really like the high expression of Ottoman music is the Mevlevi, the whirling dervish ceremonies. So those would be really cool to check out.
With Turkish music, it's very similar. I find a very similar approach to the way Partimento works, or the way that Schema theory works, because there will be these sort of melodies that reflect a particular makam. So it's almost like a schema, right? And if you hear this certain melody, then that makam immediately comes to your mind, or that they say that makam has been sort of realized, or its personality has come through, right? So a lot of the training that we get is through listening to pieces, and you can hear these melodies, and these melodies will reappear all throughout various compositions, and they mean that particular makam, and then they'll pass on to another makam. And if you use that, it's very much like schemata, and you memorize enough of them, and then you can sort of go from one to the other and build this whole thing, just like building a piece of classical music with.
That's so interesting. And they kind of existed in parallel. We had the Western European side, and I'm sure traders brought music and obviously Mozart composed his Turkish March listening to Turkish music. So there must have been that cross-pollination. I'm kind of curious how Western music kind of affected the classical Turkish music.
Yeah, I think it goes both ways, absolutely. And like you said, I mean, one of the things that did happen was, there's a lot of operatic material on Turkish stories. So there's this whole like Süleyman, and so Süleyman was a sultan in the 16th century, and he was the most powerful sultan. He's the one who first tried to conquer Vienna, and he failed. But his life became this sort of thing of legend, and he married someone famously named Hürrem. He had she was a concubine, and she had his children, but he loved her, and he eventually married her. And then there's this tragic story, because his first son with one of his earlier concubines was the most talented of his sons, and they thought that he was going to become the next sultan. But Hürrem wound up using her influence to have the actual Sultan Süleyman execute his own son from his previous concubine, and then place his son from Hürrem on the throne.
Right.
And Hürrem's name in European lore is Roxelane. And so there's operas by Handel with Roxelane. The Süleyman myth is kind of like all throughout Western music. And the other thing that's all throughout Western music is Hürrem was actually a Christian.
Oh, wow.
And also she became Muslim because she was captured as a slave.
Right.
And so there's piracy, right? And even Süleyman's Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, was actually an Italian.
Really?
He got captured. And and then what happens to these people is they convert to Islam, and then they become members of the court, and so they can rise in society quite high to the second number 2 position, which is what Ibrahim Pasha was. Hürrem was the queen, basically, the de facto queen, and so it's this really interesting thing. But there's also this like terrifying lore in the minds of Europeans that goes along with it, and I think Mozart's opera Die Entführung aus dem Serail is kind of about that.
Yeah.
Right, because the European characters get captured, and now they're living in the harem, and the women and the men, Belmonte and Pedrillo, are trying to get them out. That's the whole story. And the Pasha in the end turns out to be an ex-Christian.
Right.
And people have talked about how that's sort of kind of this Orientalist, sort of racist mind view of Mozart. But no, that's actually how things were. Pashas were captured slaves.
Right. I mean, it was just history, right?
Yeah, it's history. It's exactly what happened. It's not like this Orientalist fantasy about harems and people like all of a sudden like unrealistically being revealed as Christians. It's not true. That's actually what happened. And then with the Turkish music, a lot of times, so harmony has become a really big thing. And you know what you should really know about?
What?
Turkish music got influenced by the West, all right. And I even did a presentation on that in 1826. So the whole European Turkish thing is based on the Janissary military march, right? Which is the Janissaries were the elite Ottoman soldiers.
Okay.
And they would go to battle famously with a band of big drums and like these reed flutes, and it would be this like crazy music that they would play to terrorize their opponents, but also to give themselves, a boost.
Yep.
And so that became kind of the music that Mozart adopted in his opera, and also in his other Turkish music, the Turkish marches. In 1826, there was a sultan, Mahmud II, who decided that he wanted to transform the Ottoman court into a European-style monarchy. And so he got rid of all the Janissaries. He executed them. And in their place, guess what? He invited Donizetti Pasha.
Donizetti?
Giuseppe Donizetti, the brother of the opera composer.
Oh, wow.
And I am dying to know. So Giuseppe Donizetti came to Istanbul, and his job was to train Turkish musicians to play Western music.
Right.
Italian music, opera, orchestral music, piano. It was his job to oversee all of that. So he brought a bunch of Italians with him. And starting in 1828, all the way through the end of the 19th century, there's this mix of Italian music, Italian maestros.
Wow.
And I'm dying to know if Partimento was part of that.
I mean, it must have, right, in some
way. It must
way.
have been, right? It must have been, yeah. So, and this guy is like Donizetti's brother, and they had training. But Gaetano was the one. Gaetano, I forgot exactly where they were from, but he's not from Naples, and he wasn't trained in Naples, but he became a maestro in Naples. He did.
Okay.
He's one of the few that came from outside and was able to become a maestro in Naples.
Is that the brother?
Gaetano, yes. Yeah, I forgot exactly where it was that he was originally from.
I'm at the Wikipedia page.
Okay.
Bergamo.
But, okay. So they're not from Naples, but Gaetano trains people in Naples. So he's training people with Partimento, definitely. His brother is the one who gets invited. I don't know why, but his brother gets invited to Istanbul to become the Pasha of music. So I just feel like there must have been some Partimento. There must have been some instruction in that. And the other thing that happens is, so over time, Giuseppe Donizetti becomes influenced by Turkish music also. But he's living in Istanbul. It's not like some representation of Turkish music from Vienna. He's actually living in Istanbul. And so he's hearing like the call to prayer. He's hearing like funeral services. He's observing Muslim people like all over the place, and he's seeing their music. And
was this in
Constantinople?
Constantinople,
yes.
Yep.
And he's living in the Sultan's palace, and he knows he hears all of the court music too, the secular music, the songs and the instrumental peshrevs and all that stuff. He's hearing the Mevlevi, the whirling dervish music. He's hearing all of it. And so he winds up doing like a thing where he takes Turkish tunes, actual Turkish pieces, and he tries to arrange them for piano. And so he's got this collection of music from the 1830s of actual Turkish pieces from the Ottoman court.
Oh my gosh. If you go to his Wikipedia page, Giuseppe Donizetti, is a picture of him in full Ottoman garb.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so cool.
So he's got actual pieces of Turkish music, and he harmonized them using keyboard, piano reduction, basically. And then he sold them back in Italy. I don't know how well that was. I'm still researching this one too.
He's a pupil of Simon Meyer.
Right. So I'm also, this is like another research project of mine. I want to see, what Meyer would have taught him. If Meyer I don't know if he was a Partimento person. I'm not exactly sure.
Right. It seems he was a German.
Yeah.
But no, it says he
That
took
might be
lessons
it.
with Carlo Lenzi and later with Ferdinando Bertoni. So he had a lot of Italian training.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what went into Istanbul in the 1830s, let's say.
That's so interesting. It's like everyone who mattered had some kind of Italian training.
Yeah, even in Turkey, and so the whole reason that Turkish music nowadays we actually write it on a score with a Western staff is because of Donizetti, because Donizetti was teaching his Turkish students how to read notation.
Wow. Apparently he wrote the national anthem of the Ottoman Empire.
Yes, yeah. And he had to learn the Turkish pitch system, what I was describing to you earlier, like this kind of the major scale. He learned that. He had to learn Turkish music in order to teach it back to the Turkish musicians using Western style.
Did you read his comprehensive biography by Emre Arachi?
Yes. He's a friend of mine.
Oh, wow. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is so, that's astonishing.
And a lot of the way Turkish music sounds today is because of Donizetti's influence. And,
Isn't that crazy?
yeah, because now there's this mix of harmony. So, like, the fact that there's Turkish jazz, the fact that there's Turkish classical music, like Western style Turkish classical music, it all starts with Donizetti.
That is nuts. Okay.
And the fact that Turkish music doesn't use as many makams as it used to is because a lot of arrangements are now done with piano or guitar, so tempered instruments, and so you can't have a lot of the more like.
I was not expecting this.
Exotic. Yeah, you can't have the exotic makams.
Well, I guess much in the same way you don't have like the exotic church modes anymore,
Yeah, exactly. They're sort of like they sort of fit on top of the equal tempered guitar or piano. And so that's kind of why that happens. So it's a big influence Western music had.
Well, Professor Birson, is there anything else we left out? I don't want to leave without you mentioning anything that you wanted to mention. Is there a question that I should have asked?
No, I don't think so. I think that the thing about Haydn that I wanted to get across.
Okay, so yeah, exactly. So what's the final takeaway about Haydn?
Just the idea. I think the great line is what he says. I'm just a living clavier. And I think that all the stuff that is built into that line is just perfect. And I really wanted to get that across because Haydn's music is, and I think it was great when you asked, what about the humor and the wit? Like that's only a small part of it. I mean, really, he's getting across almost like his music comes to life, and that's what I hope that I was able to at least talk about. I think I did that. I hit that point.
Well, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Professor Birson. Professor Birson, would you like to mention to my audience what you have planned for the rest of the year?
Well, I have. I'm hoping to get my presentation into an article form, and I hope that I'll be able to submit that before the end of the year. I have an article coming out in SMTV, which is the Society for Music Theory's video journal. So I have a video article on Turkish music. So be sure to check that out. And then I'll be presenting at the Society for Music Theory annual meeting on some of the stuff I just talked about with you, with the pitches being tonal centers in Turkish makam.
Awesome. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Birson. It was a real honor for me. I hope to be able to speak with you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nikhil. It was great to be with you.